Today we're going to be talking about more horror short stories. I've been reading a lot of these as part of Horror Mayhem, a really fun booktube event that has been put together by a bunch of amazing people that I will link in the description box. The theme for week 2 was movie horror, so I read a bunch of stories that were later turned into a movie. It was such a fun week and I can't wait to tell you about the short stories that I read, so let's get started. So to start, let's talk about 3 things that don't really fit the movie theme. They do meet the requirements for Horror Mayhem, which is simply to read horror in short form. These 3 things come together in a book called My Work Is Not Yet Done, 3 Tales of Corporate Horror by Thomas Ligotti. And the first piece in this book is the titular novella, My Work Is Not Yet Done. This was really fun, especially the first half. So the main character in this novella is a guy called Frank Dominio, and he's been working in a company for ages. He works in a team with 7 people, his boss Richard and another 6 people, and it's really fun because all their names are like Mary, Perry, Barry, Sherry. They all kind of like have that rhyming sound. And he actually describes them as the 7 dwarfs. So he paints the picture of this corporate environment in a very funny way. I really enjoyed that. And things start to get really interesting when Frank shows up one day to a meeting with a super special project that he has come up with, and he presents it to his boss and his co-workers, and they're like, no, this is garbage. We don't need this. We don't want this. Stop wasting your time doing the things that you're not supposed to be doing. And Frank knows how corporate life works, so he's like, okay, I don't take offense. I take my project and put it in a drawer and we forget about it. But later that day or the next day, the boss asks him for the project. He's like, oh, hey, Frank, we're not interested in your project or anything, but just in case, I want to show it to the higher ups. So maybe if you could like show it to me, if you send me all the documents, you know, I'll see what I can do for you. And Frank knows that his boss is not well-meaning. He's trying to pass off Frank's work as his own. So he tells him, yeah, I'll send it to you later, but he never sends it and he tries to like avoid the situation. But then Frank starts noticing that everyone in his team, all of his co-workers, seem to be conspiring against him. In these very small but very insidious ways, they just make his life at work more and more difficult. But Frank has been working in this company for so long that he knows how things are, so he tries to not escalate the situation. But his co-workers do escalate the situation, and eventually something happens that makes Frank decide that he's not taking this anymore and he's out for revenge. So he starts making this plan for payback. And it's really intense, like Frank's not playing around. So when he starts carrying out his plan, everything seems to be going well until something happens to Frank, something unexpected, something that in a normal situation would make the person stop carrying out their plan, but nothing stopping Frank. And this plan he had that was already horrible gets even worse. So the first half of the novella is this setup that I've just summarized for you. And I really enjoyed that because, as I said, Thomas Ligotti frames these situations in a very humorous way. And I really enjoyed this kind of like paranoid feeling that your coworkers are scheming against you. And the second half of the novella, when the revenge part actually happens, was also very fun, very entertaining, very creative, sometimes in a very disgusting way. But in terms of the narrative, it had much less cohesion than the first part. So even though I enjoyed it, I can't say I was blown away by it. In this book, we also have a short story called I Have a Special Plan for This World. And here we also follow a main character, although we know very little about this character. We just know that he works for this company, and we also don't really know what this company is. Basically, it's just described as a company that does paperwork. And this company has been recently relocated to a town that is famously known as Murder Town because there is a really high crime rate. However, that's not a very good look for the company, so they retry to rebrand it as the Golden City because it is engulfed by this this mysterious yellowish haze, and we come to find out that actually this haze or this yellow fog may be in some way related to the high crime rate and the large amount of murders that happen in this company. And not only that, but the fog is inside the office building itself, and it seems to get thicker and denser the more stress the people working in this company are experiencing. And I'll just say that for most of the people working there, things don't end well. I loved this short story. For me, it encapsulated really well this concept of corporate terror, and I would go as far as to say that it was a more condensed, more effective version of what Ligotti tried to do in his novella. So this was definitely the highlight of the book for me. Also, with these two first pieces, I was able to tick off the cosmic square in our bingo board. There are definitely some otherworldly forces at play here. The last short story was called The Nightmare Network, and I'm not gonna lie, this was very confusing. I'm not sure what the story is, but I think that's kind of the point. It's also delivered in a found document kind of style, so it includes classified ads, some snippets of a movie script, I believe, some memos, some emails, and other documents like that. And it is about two rival companies that exist in this futuristic world where these two corporations have acquired most of what is human experience. It's really hard to explain, but basically they have taken over the whole corporate world, and now they're kind of like in a battle to see which one will consume the other. As I said, I didn't really get it, but also when I read it, I was really sleepy, so it's definitely one that I would want to reread a bit more carefully, because I have the feeling that most of the story is in little clues scattered throughout all these documents. So I'll try reading it again, and if I change my mind, I'll update you. However, I did use this to tick off the techno horror box in the bingo board. Oh, and actually, these may also fit dystopian horror, so I'm gonna cross it for now. Moving on to the movie horror, the first book I started was Alvin Schwartz Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark. I was super excited for these because I never got to read these as a kid. I didn't even know it existed. In Mexico, we didn't have this, but everyone always talks about how much fun this was, and I really want to know what it was about. And these are super short stories. Some of them are 1 page long, some are 3 pages long at maximum. I read the first 3 sections, which is only about a quarter of the book, but I had so much fun with this. The stories are written in a very casual way, so once again, this is like stories that you would sit around with your friends and like try to scare each other, and some of them were actually really creepy. I feel like I would have loved this as a kid. Obviously, I'm not going to go through each one of them. I will say that I read a story about a witch, a story about killer animals. There was a killer wolf and some killer alligators. This whole book definitely ticks off the cozy horror category, and surprisingly, many of these stories I would say that fall into the psychological horror category. Actually, the favorite one I read is called The Girl Who Stood on a Grave, and it is about kids that are just hanging out during a party, and one of the boys says, "Don't ever stand on a grave after dark. The person inside will grab you." And one of the girls says, "That's not true, it's just superstition." And then the boy says, "I'll give you $1 if you stand on the grave." And the girl says, "I'll do it right now." So they go to the cemetery and they all watch the girl do this. And obviously, I won't spoil it for you. Honestly, this is one of the most effective psychological horror stories I have ever read. By the way, this is the illustration for that story. And my other favorite one was called A New Horse. This is the witch story. This is the illustration, it's so horrible. Anyways, this starts with 2 men that work in a farm, and then one of these men tells the other, "An awful thing happens every night. A witch turns me into a horse and rides me all over the countryside." So yeah, that's already horrifying as it is. Then from this book, I read H.P. Lovecraft's The Color Out of Space, which is a classic short story that I've never read before. I don't always love Lovecraft's works, but this short story actually really worked for me. I really enjoyed it. It is about this small village in the town of Arkham where a lot of Lovecraft stories take place, and one day this huge rock falls out of the sky, and it is assumed that it comes from space. So we can tick off the alien square in the bingo board, and everything that comes into contact with this rock starts to become like blackened and die, and it's really weird. And then scientists come and they try to take samples of the rock to study what's it made of, but the rock starts like shrinking and then eventually disappears, so they can study it in the lab. So the scientists come to the rock and they start chipping away at it, and after breaking it for a while they find like its core, and it's this like soft gelatinous kind of thing, and I actually can't remember what happens. I think they take it to the lab and it also disappears or something like that. The point is that once it is exposed, there's kind of like these light or energy emanating from the thing, the exposed gel thingy. And the light it emits is in this otherworldly color that no one can describe. It's nowhere in the spectrum of known visible light. And it makes the plants glow and it makes them swing in a really strange way. And the insects start behaving differently. The little animals that live in the foresty area around it start acting weird. And the people also start acting weird. They start going kind of insane. What I liked about the story is that it was extremely atmospheric. It was very eerie, and the way it is narrated, it gives it this feeling of like urban legend, so you don't know necessarily what is true, what isn't true, but the reality is that the evidence is there. This town has now turned into like a complete wasteland, and also the very slow escalation of the things that happen creates a very good build-up of tension, and in general this feeling of unsettledness. In general, cosmic horror doesn't always do it for me because it always seems a bit too abstract, but this felt very real, like a very real present threat. So yeah, I was very happy with this story. And lastly, from this collection by Koji Suzuki, this is called Dark Water, Terror Reaches New Depths. Obviously, this inspired the movie Dark Water, both the Japanese version and the American remake. I love them both, so I was very excited to read this story. Once I read it, I remember that I've read this before. When I was a teenager, I had a Koji Suzuki phase, let's say, and I read a lot of his books. So once I started, I was like, this seems a bit familiar, and my memory was like shaken a little bit. I think I really enjoyed this collection, and I like how it is framed. So it starts with a grandmother whose grandchild has come to visit, and they go for a walk by the water, and they find like a lot of objects that have brought in by the currents, and the grandmother tells the grandchild horror stories based on these objects that they find. So that's kind of like the overarching theme of the collection. So the story that actually inspired the movie is the first one, and it is not called Dark Water, it is called Floating Water. The premise is quite similar to the movie. This single mom and her little daughter, they move into this apartment, and one day they go up to the rooftop area to play with some sparklers, and I don't remember if this happens in the movie, but in the story they find like a little Hello Kitty bag under the large water tank, and the daughter is like, please, can I take it? And the mom's like, no, you can't keep things that are not yours. So they bring it to the front desk and like wait for someone to claim it, but no one claims it, so it goes in the bin. However, when they next go up to the roof again, the bag is there again, and this is just one of a string of strange occurrences that start happening to this mom and girl. And what the mom finds out is that all of these things seem to be related to something that happened to another little girl that used to live in that building and that went missing. I really enjoyed this story as well. It was also very atmospheric. It was very creepy, and it had this traditional ghost story feel where the main character constantly questions herself whether she's experiencing something supernatural or if there is a rational explanation for the things that have been happening. And the thing that I did not remember, that I was pleasantly, I think, surprised by, is that in the story there is no resolution to whether the events are actually a ghost or not. Everything that happens, there is some kind of plausible deniability for it being supernatural. And it actually ends kind of abruptly, so you are just left to make that decision on your own. I'm not gonna lie, I was a little bit surprised when I turned the page and I realized that that was the end of the story, but I loved myself an ambiguous ending. I loved myself unexplained phenomena in my stories, so overall I was also pretty pleased with this. By the way, I haven't watched this movie and I also haven't watched the Color Out of Space movie, so if you have watched them, please let me know if you would recommend that I do. If you watched Dark Water, please let me know if you love it as much as I do. Tell me if you prefer the Japanese version or the American version. Also talk to me about anything you want. What have you been reading? What are you planning to read? Anything you want, and I will talk to you in my next video. Bye!